That's a bold and complex question, one that challenges popular narratives. To answer it responsibly, we must navigate between historical fact, esoteric and suppressed histories, and modern reinterpretations of identity and colonization. Let's break it down into historical and interpretive layers. Who are the Moors? Classical definition, 7th to 15th centuries, the Moors were predominantly Muslim peoples of North African Berber and Arab descent, known for conquering and ruling parts of Spain and Portugal Al-Andalus from 711 AD to 1492. They were renowned for their advanced sciences, architecture, and knowledge, but also engaged in military conquest, slavery, and trade. Over time, Moor became a broad term applied by Europeans to describe any dark-skinned, non-Christian people, including North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, and even some South Asians. Expanded definition in the Americas. In the Moorish Science Temple, early 1900s, Prophet Noble Drew Ali taught that Moors were the true identity of Black Americans, descended from Moroccan and Canaanite roots, who had been stripped of nationality and sovereignty. Some scholars and indigenous researchers claim the term Moor was applied to many dark-skinned indigenous people in early colonial records, e.g. Black Indians or Moors of the Carolinas. So, depending on the lens, the Moors are either 1. Foreign North African conquerors who expanded into Europe and influenced global history, or 2. Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples of the Americas whose original identity was obscured by colonization and reclassification. 2. Possible Moorish roles in indigenous disenfranchisement. Let's look at two competing theories. A. Moors as foreign allies of colonial powers, disenfranchisement theory. In this theory, some scholars argue that Moors were used by European powers as instruments of empire. 1. Moorish privateers and pirates. After the fall of Granada, 1492, Moors were displaced or forcibly converted Moriscos. Some became pirates and mercenaries. North African Barbary Moors signed treaties with European powers to raid, enslave, and trade, including the capture of indigenous and African peoples. Some Moorish captains may have aided Spanish or Portuguese conquest, helping to map coasts, enslave peoples, or manage shipping routes during the early Atlantic slave trade. Half number 2. Moroccan colonization schemes. In the 16th century, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur of Morocco had ambitions to colonize the Americas, sending agents and scholars to study the New World. Some researchers believe Moroccan sailors and soldiers may have allied with the Spanish or operated independently, bringing knowledge of navigation, war, and commerce that would later be used against indigenous populations. 3. Adoption of foreign titles and systems. The use of Islamic governance, court systems, and even paperwork systems, like contracts, may have influenced colonial systems that stripped indigenous peoples of land via treaty fraud and deceptive contract law. Interpretation. In this view, some Moors were co-opted into global systems of conquest, either willingly or under coercion, and played roles in the machinery that undermined indigenous sovereignty, particularly via maritime trade, slavery, and law. B. Moors as indigenous descendants themselves. Reclassification theory. This view flips the narrative. 1. Reclassified indigenous peoples. After the Indian Removal Act and other genocidal policies, many indigenous people were reclassified as Negroes, coloreds, or Moors to strip them of treaty rights. In old census records, 1700s to 1800s, some tribal peoples in the Carolinas, Virginia, and Mississippi were labeled as Moors. This has led some researchers to argue the Moors were actually indigenous Americans, not foreign Africans, whose identity was manipulated by colonial law. 2. The Moorish American Identity Movement. Noble Drew Ali and later leaders taught that Black Americans were not Africans, but descendants of ancient Moabites and indigenous peoples of North America. The U.S. government classified these groups as Moorish, yet denied them tribal status or land, a form of disenfranchisement by mislabeling. Interpretation. Moors didn't disenfranchise indigenous peoples. They were indigenous peoples who were themselves disenfranchised through legal erasure and reclassification. The legal and strategic element. Treaty of Peace and Friendship, 1786, Morocco, U.S. The treaty signed between the Moroccan Empire and the United States granted Moors certain protected statuses. Some argue this treaty was later used to create a separate legal identity for Moors and deny indigenous claims to land under the guise of foreign nationality. This raises the question, were Moors protected foreigners or erased Americans? Ivul. Summary. Dual legacy of the Moors. Role of Moors. Foreign allies of empire. Participated in colonization via piracy, trade, and Islamic legal systems. Aided European conquest. Reclassified indigenous. Were indigenous peoples stripped of identity and sovereignty by being labeled Moors instead of tribal names. Legal manipulation tool. Moorish identity used as a jurisdictional wedge to separate people from their true tribal land rights. The Moors occupy a paradoxical space in the history of indigenous disenfranchisement. In some cases, they were instruments of imperial conquest, especially in maritime law, privateering, and colonization. In other cases, the term Moor was used to erase indigenous identity, creating a legal limbo that denied both African Americans and indigenous peoples access to sovereignty, land, and self-determination.